The band with Matt had never had a bass player, but Steve wanted to bring one in. "I know this other guy," Steve said. The guy's name was Gene Klein, and he and Steve had played together as teens in a band called the Long Island Sounds. Gene was living somewhere out of town now, Steve said. He was apparently a few years older than I was and had already graduated from college. I didn't care whether he lived in Sullivan County or Staten Island. If there was a possibility that we'd be moving toward creating a real band, I was all for it. One night I went over to Steve's Manhattan apartment in Washington Heights, not far from where I had lived as a little kid. Steve's room was painted black, and in the room was a big, burly guy. "Stan," said Steve, "this is Gene Klein." Gene had long hair and a beard under his double chin. He was very overweight. I was pretty stocky back then, but this guy was huge. He was wearing overalls and sandals and looked like something from the then-new country music TV show Hee Haw. Gene made it clear right away that he didn't see us as his musical equals. He played some songs for us that I thought were sort of goofy. Then he challenged me to play one of my songs. So I played something called Sunday Driver, which I later retitled Let Me Know. He seemed completely thrown that someone besides John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and Gene Klein could write a song. It was a moment of realization for him. Here was another guy who wasn't famous who could actually write a song. He was visibly taken aback. He mumbled, I was annoyed that he saw himself as operating at a level that qualified him to pass judgment on me, as though all that mattered was his approval. Particularly because I hadn't thought much of his songs. The idea that he was judging me seemed arrogant, condescending, and ludicrous. He made it clear that he felt himself to be judging from a higher plane, and I didn't like that at all. Gene, of course, had no clue about my ear, which was covered up by my hair, but I was pre-programmed to dislike being scrutinized and judged. It wasn't a nice thing to do as far as I was concerned, and I wasn't eager to work with the guy. Another night, Steve, a bass player named Marty Cohn, and I played a free gig at a coffee shop on Broadway and 111th Street called Forlini's Third Phase. The place was lined with styrofoam, and we played with a bunch of amplified gear. We played some originals and some covers, including Mountain's Mississippi Queen, and the crowd got into it. Gene came to that gig too because Steve had borrowed some of his gear, and he was clearly impressed. At some point after that, I answered an ad in the alternative weekly, The Village Voice, for a guitar player. When I rang the number, I found out that the guy who had placed the ad, Brooke Ostrander, was the keyboard player in a band looking for a lead guitarist, not a rhythm guy like me. That was the end of that. But not long afterward, Gene called me and asked whether I would come to New Jersey and work on a demo tape his group was trying to finish. He wanted me to come for a day or two. I agreed. Strangely, it turned out the group was working at the home of their keyboard player, Brooke Ostrander, and this was the same band Brooke had placed the ad about. Brooke was already a school music teacher. Gene, too, bragged about some white-collar job he had that paid $5 an hour, a fortune at the time. They had a home tape recording machine as opposed to something fancier that might be used in a studio, but we worked all day. Toward the end of the night, Brooke and I smoked some weed using a big fish-shaped bong. I was absolutely out of my head, and with the workday done, we listened to Pink Floyd and Jethro Tull until it occurred to me that I didn't know where I was sleeping that night. "Come on into the bedroom," Brooke said to me. Uh-oh. That was one of the longest walks I'd ever taken. I wasn't sure what to do, but when he opened the door, I saw 2 beds in the room. Phew! Thank you, Lord. Working with Gene like that, I could see that we had some things in common. His family were Holocaust survivors. He was smart and serious. Even though he and Brooke were working in New Jersey, Gene turned out to live only about 15 minutes away from me in Queens. It also turned out that he'd had a band upstate during college, and they had played live quite a lot. He had a lot to offer. He could sing well and play bass well. He could write songs. Perhaps most importantly, Gene was focused. One thing I had figured out by then was that talent, like everything else, was just a starting point. What counted was what you did with it. I knew I wasn't the most talented guitar player or the best singer or the best writer, but I could do all of those things, and I had a complete vision of what it was going to take to succeed. A vision that included working. Gene wrote a lot of very odd songs. Maybe it was because he was originally from another country. I wasn't sure. He had one called Stanley the Parrot, another called My Uncle is a Raft. He even had one called My Mother is the Most Beautiful Woman in the World. Okay, that's a bit weird. Still, the more we played together, the better it got. Gene and I liked the same kind of music and we could sing harmonies well together. I decided I wanted to work with him. I could see a bigger picture now, and despite his idiosyncrasies as an only child, teamwork was not Gene's strong suit. We both were intelligent enough to know how to harness ambition. And after all, it would be a lot easier to slay the dragon with a second person to help. As we continued to rehearse together, Steve Coronel ended up joining us too, and we slowly started to become something more and more like an actual band.